Great John Coltrane. It's hard to even mention his name given the depths of his spirituality and artistic virtuosity. And
Here he is,
album 1959-60, Giant Steps, just after he had left Miles's quartet and formed his own quartet, is one of the heights of, I think, cultural life in American civilization in the 20th century, actually.
Now, you mentioned Coltrane many times in the book.
Yes, indeed.
And Chekhov.
Absolutely right.
First, why Coltrane? You talk about you're going to teach Coltrane.
Absolutely right. I'm writing a book on Chekhov and Coltrane, actually. But Coltrane, for me, is a culminating figure in a very rich tradition of blues and jazz. A blues that injects a blue note into Western history, into Western musical harmony, a note of dissonance, disturbance, defiance, wrestling with darkness, but always sustaining a sense of endurance and stamina, rooted in a deep love of self and a love of others. And be it a Ma Rainey, be it a Billie Holiday, a Sarah Vaughan, a Miles Davis, the Thelonious Monk, or John Coltrane, you have this story of a people who, up against institutional terrorism, slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, police brutality, still forge a sense of self with integrity and dignity. That's what I hear in John Coltrane.
Here's a little bit more from this album. And John Coltrane died when?
He died in 1967. He was 40 years old, same age as Franz Kafka, actually.
And what are you hearing right here?
Well, here you get the lyrical, the kind of a deep lyrical, it was what he vocalizes a European instrument, the saxophone, but it's expressing both a spirituality rooted in black struggle, but reaches out for the struggle of others, be they in Russia, be they in Kurdistan, be they in Greece, be they in Guatemala, be they in Chile. One has to be silent in the face of that kind of depth, actually.
Did you ever know him?
No, I never did. I never did. But I have access to the tradition. You know, the same tradition of that links one to, in the popular level of Curtis Mayfield just passed, Stevie Wonder, Wynton Marsalis.
And you're going to teach him?
Yes. But as a historical figure, that is to say, as somebody who represents something that is both quintessentially American and quintessentially African American.
Now, the second person I mentioned, because he also is mentioned quite often, actually more often than Coltrane, is this man right here.
Exactly.
Anton Chekhov. Who was he?
Yeah, he died at 44 years old in 1904. He wrote Three Sisters, I think the greatest play of late modernity, first performed January 1901, the first month of the century. I still hold the century begins in 1901 rather than 1900. But Anton Chekhov is, I think, the towering literary figure of late modernity. And what I mean by that is that what he actually is able to do is to force us to wrestle with inescapable disillusionment, disappointment, disheartenment, and yet still be able to, like Coltrane, compassionately endure, to look the nullity of who and what we are, to look the absurdity of so much of our history, and still sustain ourselves as struggling, shuddering, suffering agents in the world.
Now here's your the cover of your book. Did you ever notice the resemblance?
You know, some people have said that. I didn't really notice. I think Chekhov much more handsome, though. And I think I've probably got a little bit more style than he does, coming out of the black tradition. But that's a compliment. That's a grand compliment. He, medical doctor, he says he's got two commandments: help the poor and honor the fourth commandment, his father and his mother. And Chekhov, he was agnostic, I'm Christian, but his understanding of love, compassion, justice is deeply shaped by his Russian Orthodox background, actually. Absolutely.
And he lived, what?
1860 to 1904.
What's this? What's in here? Lots of pages to start with.
Well, it's a testament of a particular human being, of a particular brother who's trying to make sense of the world and leave the world just a little bit better than when he found it, when he makes his exit. Very much a product of the black church, a product of a loving black family with mom and dad and my older brother and two younger sisters, deeply empowered by Harvard College, Princeton University in philosophy, and highly privileged in terms of being able to have access to time to write and lecture and run my mouth around the country. But in the end, I think I'm still first and foremost a blues man in the life of the mind, first and foremost a jazz man in the world of ideas. And what I mean by that is always keeping track of the unjustified suffering in the world, the unnecessary social misery, keeping a limelight on the plight and predicament of what Franz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. How do we broaden the scope of human dignity? That's what I'm after.
Picked up the Baltimore Sun a couple of weeks ago, and they had a picture of you in there. They had a feature article, and under the cut line it said, the 5th most popular professor at Harvard. Where do they get that fact?
Oh, I teach a course. I teach an introductory course, Afro-American Studies 10, and we have about 400 students or so, and it's the 5th most popular course at Harvard College. I think that's probably what they have in mind.
And what determines whether it's popular?
Just the number of students. Now, I teach a course which is not part of the core curriculum. So I think actually if it was part of the core curriculum, I could have about 700 or 800, but I don't like to have my course required. That's part of the legacy of the 60s that I'm a part of. I'd rather have the students choose, as it were. But again, it's really, you know, popularity is superficial. I want to be able to engage in the grand calling of a Socratic teacher, which is not to persuade and convince students, but to unsettle and unnerve and maybe even unhouse a few students so that they experience that wonderful vertigo and dizziness and recognizing at least for a moment that their worldview rests on pudding, but then see that they have something to fall back on. It's the shaping and forming of critical sensibility. That for me is what the high calling of pedagogy really is.
Basic books, Civitas books. Civitas is what?
Civitas is actually a particular slice of basic books. I was very blessed to have a dynamic editor in Tim Bartlett who suggested this idea to me. I had really actually never even contemplated the idea of bringing together different slices of the 14 books that I've actually written and then the other 6 that's edited. And he said, no, I think this is the time. I said, well, I'm only 45 years old. I'm 46 now, and I've always been, I've already been accused of being a little bit too premature in trying to bring together some of my own reflections, and even been accused of being a little bit too centered on my own projects. I said, that's the last thing I need is a Cornell West reader. He said, no, I think it's necessary. I said, well, sure, let's see. Let's see. And it's actually worked very well.
So what's the range of years here?
I think the first essay on Nietzsche was 1981 up to 1999, so we got about 18 years.
Now, as you know, there are all kinds of things in there. Interviews that you've had with friends and colleagues. There are articles that you've written and critiques of everybody from Jackie Robinson to Julian Malveaux.
Oh, yes.
Plus, there's lots of philosophy, and I must tell you, I'm going to read for this generalist here a couple of lines, and just because there's times when you go away. Yeah, but here, this is the number 7. This is 17th chapter. The Political Intellectual. It's written in 1987. You're talking about John Dewey. First of all, who is John Dewey?
The great John Dewey. He's the greatest social philosopher produced in America. He was born in the same year actually as Darwin's Origins, 1859, and he died June 1, 1952. He lived a long time.
And you write, this is in an interview with Anders Stevenson.
Anders Stephenson, my good friend, is a distinguished historian, professor at Columbia University.
Okay.
Yes.
When philosophers talk about pragmatism, you're going to have to help me through some of this. They are talking about Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. For me, it is principally Dewey. 3 theses are basic. 1, anti-realism in ontology.
Yes.
So that the correspondence theory of truth is called into question, and one can no longer appeal to reality as a court of appeal to adjudicate between conflicting theories of the world.
Yes.
2, anti-fundamentalism in epistemology, so that one cannot, in fact, invoke non-inferential, intrinsically credible elements in experience to justify claims about experience.
Right.
And 3, detranscendentalizing of the subject, the elimination of mind itself as a sphere of inquiry.
Absolutely. 3 very crucial moves. But
What are you saying? I mean, talk to a C student here.
Right. No, see, what we're saying is this. We can start with C.I. Lewis, the great C.I. Lewis. He says that pragmatism is the doctrine that all problems are at bottom problems of conduct, that all judgments are implicitly judgments of value. And just as there's no valid distinction between the theoretical and the practical, there is no separation between a quest for truth and the justifiable ends of action. What does that mean? That means that social practice sits at the center of how we understand our quest for truth, our quest for knowledge, our quest for the good, our quest for the beautiful, and the attempt to look for something other than contingent, shifting, changes social practices, to look for something other than social practices that allows us to adjudicate between conflicting views of the world, right, is called into question. What does that mean? That means that, okay, when scientists tell us that this table actually consists of electrons and neutrons, right, they could be right, they could be wrong. We believe them at the moment. In that sense, they're a secular priesthood, very much like the medieval period, where they believed the priest, whatever the priest told them. We believe physicists. They could be wrong. 150 years from now, it'd be very different. Well, nobody ever was able to see neutrons or protons. Neutrons or protons are theoretical posits, but they're the best thing we have at the moment. So we appeal to the practices of this scientific community in light of reliable methods that are connecting various trails of evidence that allow them to make valid inferences and thereby draw reliable conclusions. We say, fine. But we're still appealing to the social practices of that community. Now, that doesn't mean tables don't exist. They do exist. There's no doubt about that. They do exist independent of my mind. But we can't ask the table what it is. The table doesn't speak. Nature does not speak. Black holes in the cosmos don't speak. We construct them in the only way we know how. Language, what is language? A social practice, you see. So pragmatism here is simply saying we are temporal beings, we're historical beings, we are communal beings. And in our cooperative work together, we try to understand the world. We don't construct the world in the sense of just projecting it in an idealistic way. But we do interpret the world and understand the world, and in the end, that's all we have to go on, you see.
Let's go back to the beginning. You were born in what city?
Born in the great metropolis of Tulsa, Oklahoma, June 2nd, 1953. Moton Hospital, same hospital actually as the Wilson brothers of the great Gap Band.
And what were your parents doing then?
Now, Dad was actually, he was trying to get into dental school, I think, at the University of Tulsa. And Mom was a homemaker, already in college and on her way to become both a teacher and principal, and just recently had a elementary school named after her.
In Tulsa?
In Sacramento. You know, we
You moved to Sacramento?
Yeah, exactly.
How long did you live in Tulsa?
I stayed in Tulsa just a few weeks, actually. And we moved to Topeka, Kansas. And then from Topeka, Kansas, we ended up in Sacramento, my dearly beloved Sacramento, California.
But your grandfather was a minister in Tulsa?
My granddad, Reverend C.L. West Metropolitan Baptist Church, was one of the great ministers and pastors of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Self-taught, self-educated, and he loved his people.
Now, I know your dad died in 1994?
Yeah, Dad passed in '94.
How about your mom?
Absolutely. Mom's stronger than ever. She's got more energy, much more intelligence and wisdom and beauty than I do.
Where does she live?
She lives in Sacramento.
And you mentioned your brothers?
Oh, yeah. My brother Cliff, who is, if I could be 1/3 of the person he is, I would actually be living a grand life. He's in Sacramento, too.
What's he do?
He does so many things in computer software. He's a track coach. He's a wise person in the community. He's also an artist and writes music, father.
You have other brother?
Companion. No, he's the only one.
Only brother, no
He's the only one.
sisters?
And 2 younger sisters, yeah. We've got wonderful 2 sisters. Cynthia, who's marvelous. She's there in Sacramento. And then Cheryl. So we've got my mother still alive, my brother Clifton, and then my sister Cynthia and Cheryl.
What year did you graduate from high school in Sacramento?
1970, John F. Kennedy High School.
And then you went to Harvard?
Then I went off to Harvard College.
How did you even think about going from all the way from Sacramento to Harvard?
Well, at that time, I just wanted to be with what many consider to be the best. And there's a lot of superb places around. You know, you got Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Fisk, Morehouse, Howard, University of Chicago. But I said, well, no, someone that said Harvard was the best. Let me go spend some time with the best and see what things are like.
How did you get in? What kind of student were you at Sacramento?
Sacramento, I was nearly 4.0. Student body president, played first violin, and was captain of the track, with the cross-country team and so forth. So I had done some things. No doubt about it.
So
but 30 years earlier, I wouldn't have gotten in.
Why?
Well, the racism, the white supremacy still operating. I would have gone to Howard, which still would have been a wonderful education and so forth, but I probably would not have gotten in. It was the social movements of the 60s, especially the death of Martin King, the uprisings, the 212 uprisings, April 4th, 1968, that opened the doors for someone like myself to gain access. But once there, I had to do my job.
Were there any black professors at Harvard in 1970?
Oh, sure. Martin Kilson, who was my very good friend and mentor, he was there. He was the first tenured professor at Harvard, Martin Kilson, in political science, in government department.
Who was the first philosopher you got interested in?
First philosopher was, I had always read Kierkegaard and Pascal and Montaigne on my own.
On your own?
On my own.
In high school?
In high school, actually, in Bookmobile, actually, in the black community in Glen Elder, where I grew up for most of my childhood, which was a marvelous place to grow up. But I was reading on my own, and so I was just trying to make sense of, this psychic tear of being black in America, trying to make sense of this profound sadness and sorrow that's set at the center, not just of black life, but of human life, and how you somehow transfigure it into some joy, how you transfigure it into some sense of pleasure. And so Pascal and Kierkegaard and Montaigne spoke to that sense that I felt. Even as a Christian, I always felt that the cross was much more weightier than some of my fellow Christians put it. Most American Christians are post-resurrection Christians. They want resurrection. They want a crown without a cross, whereas I was much more cross-centered. How do you keep the love flowing on that cross in the form of the blood? Engagement with the dark side, the underside of human history and the human predicament and so forth. And that's what I saw in Pascal. He says, Christ is on the cross till the end of time. When I read that line in Pascal, I said, my God, he understands something about the human condition, and he certainly understands something about black people in the United States. Here you have a land of dreams and possibility, and yet slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, segregation, discrimination. What's going on? We do love the ideals of freedom, yes, but we're unfree. We love the ideals of democracy, but we're voiceless. James Weldon Johnson, the Negro National Anthem says, lift every voice. What a democratic ideal. But we're voiceless for the most part. So when I read Pascal, though he's, 17th century French Jansenist thinker, which is a Catholic, particular kind of Catholic thinker influenced by Calvinistic sensibilities, I said, he speaks to me. Very much so.
What year did you graduate? I know you have 3 years at Harvard. What year was it?
Yeah, I finished a year early. It was 1973.
Then what?
Then off to Princeton.
For how long?
I was there for 2 years, finished up courses, took my exams, went back to Cambridge, and began mainly to write literature for a while, mainly reading the Russians, though.
Where did you get your doctorate degree?
Princeton.
The Ethical Dimensions of Marxist Thought.
Yeah, that was a dissertation. That was a dissertation.
You like
Deeply
Marx?
influenced by my good friend and mentor and brother Richard Rorty, one of the towering figures, not just towering philosophers, towering intellectuals of our day.
Professor at Princeton.
He was my professor at Princeton, but I had so many others. There was Paul Benasserif, who's my good friend. He is a logician, and we can go on and on. Tim Scanlon, Walter Kaufman, Tom Nagel, and others. It was a wonderful place to be, actually.
Do you like Marx?
You know? Well, the Marxist tradition is, for me, is a crucial one because Marx himself put the focus on working people, and he understood that if we're going to understand capitalist markets, we have to understand the power relations between labor and management, between working people and their bosses, and that the power relations are asymmetric. That is to say that the bosses in management have more power than workers and employees. And he knew there was going to be tension and a struggle. And he said, I want to keep the focus in a very Christian way on the least of these, on those who are catching the most hell. And of course, unfortunately, we associate Marx in America with repressive communist regimes, you see. But Marx himself in the 19th century says what? There will be vast levels of wealth inequality. There will be oligopolies and monopolies at the top that devour more and more businesses with unaccountable concentrations of power and wealth. How do we ensure the dignity of working people? How do we ensure their voices are heard, not just through the ballot box, but at the workplace? Now, as a radical Democrat, someone who comes out of the tradition of a Walt Whitman and a W.B. Du Bois, I have to take very seriously that Marxist tradition, even as I reject the regimentation and the repression that we rightly associate with communist regimes in the 20th century. So that's why when I talk about the progressive Marxist theory, that there are basic needs of working people around the world that remain unmet. Housing, jobs with a living wage, health care. Look at America, 44 million fellow citizens, but no health care insurance. What's going on? The richest nation in the history of the world. Even the more vulnerable, children. 1 out of 5 children living in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. That's a disgrace in many ways, you see. Nearly 1 out of 2 black and brown children living in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. The Marxist tradition simply says we have to be able to tell a story about how it is that the levels of wealth inequality are what they are, and why it is that too many working people and poor people still don't have access to food, shelter, health care, and so on and so forth. I mean, you think, for example, Brian, you've got 1% of the population in America who own 48% of the net financial wealth. That's oligarchic, in many ways plutocratic, and in some ways pigmentocratic, given the history of white supremacy. We got 3 billionaires in the world who have more wealth than the bottom 48 nations. The top 225 richest individuals have more wealth than 41% of all of humanity. That's 2.7 billion people. And the Marxist tradition simply says, look, we have to be able to tell a story. How do we analyze this? Not by demonizing other people, but by saying, well, there's something about profit-making that ought to take into consideration much more satisfying basic needs as opposed to simply producing more luxury goods in order to make money, you see. But that's a tough message for America.
Let me jump through, because you've got lots of philosophy and lots of your past. Let me just jump to a question that I want you to look 100 years down the road, based on, you call this century, I go back and our ghastly century.
Oh, yes. Unprecedented levels of barbarity and brutality, and I would say bestiality, but that's being unfair to the beast, really. You're talking about 200 million fellow human beings.
Okay, just for a second.
This past century.
Jump 100 years from now. The year is 3000.
Yeah.
Based on what you know, what you've lived, throw it all in and tell us where you think the black human being will be in the world in the year 3000.
Oh, that's so difficult, brother, because it depends on what we do. So much depends on what we do. But you and I, Americans, how we relate to Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, indigenous peoples, and so forth, I think that we could have a democratic future, and I banked my my life on fighting for the empowerment of the demos, of fellow citizens here and around the world, that their voices are heard at the highest levels of decision-making processes and institutions that guide and regulate their lives. But if the democratic tradition fails, or if it's weakened, made more feeble, we're in deep trouble, because we see authoritarian regimes mediated through the new technologies. Because, see, I don't fetishize technology at all. You see, the internet, new forms of communication, these are wonderful breakthroughs, yes, but they're human creations. And all human creations can be used for good or ill. We got the same hatreds and the same loves, the same insecurities and anxieties, the same possibilities for positive breakthrough. That's true for the radio, TV, internet, across the board. And it's still under the aegis of capital, which is to say its aim still is profit-making, and therefore we have to have some democratic accountability through the nation state, or some way in which everyday people's voice can be heard vis-a-vis the voices of the few, you see. So that I think there's real possibility for the 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. But on the other hand, we could have major setbacks. I mean, it could be the case, for example, that, like, for example, 1940, you only had 1 or 2 democracies, right? Because fascism had taken over much of the world. And it could be that we have a brief moment of democratic flowering, and then it dries up. And that means that this particular book and my voice would be just a voice in the wilderness.
Well, stop there just for a second and talk about...
I hope that that's not the case.
You're 46.
46 years old. Absolutely right. And glad to have lived that long.
Well, just talk about what's happening around your world. This is Civitas Books, put out by Basic Books, which is owned by Perseus Books, which I believe the gentleman's name's Pearl, that owns the whole thing.
Right.
Would a company like this, Mr. Pearl's a white man.
Yes, he's a white brother.
He also did public affairs books and owns a lot of other things. But Civitas, as I understand, is run by Skip Gates.
Well, he is one of the... Well, he's got a... I think he's got a small stake in that particular slice, but that's a slice of a whole host of different slices. It's a very complex operation. I don't fully understand, actually. But no, Brother Skip's got a hand.
But my point is, and he's running the African American Studies program at Harvard.
Absolutely right.
Is all this a plus? Is it a big change from when you were there in 1971?
Oh, sure. Oh, very
and
much so.
What do you think's doing that? What's
well,
making
you got
it
a number of things at work. I mean, one is that you see in the market-driven civilization of which we're a part, the commodification is ubiquitous. That is to say, the profit-making, money-taking is ubiquitous. And so the real challenge is, like any other human activity, can that be used in such a way that it accents what I would call non-market values, which has the truth-telling about commodification, which has to do with organizing and mobilizing people against some of the deleterious consequences, some of the negative effects of commodification. Because commodification is here to stay. There's no escape. And actually, there's some good things about it. You know, it produces high levels of productivity, reinforces ingenuity, technological innovation. That's very important. But the dark side is what? High levels of inequality, and at the personal existential level, isolation, loneliness, what the great Arthur Miller calls the American disease of unrelatedness, lack of community, failed intimacy, like the American Hamlet, Blanche Dubois, in A Streetcar Named Desire. So through the market, through commodification, can we engage in truth-telling, exposing of lies, bearing of witness, that accent non-market values, but the irony is it's still through the market. It's the only way we can communicate, the only way we can reach out to one another for the most part on a broad scale. Now, face-to-face and soul-to-soul is still possible, but on a broad scale, you see. So we have to keep a kind of dialectical understanding of commodification. This book itself, a commodity, no doubt, but critical of the very process. Well, that's part and parcel of how, in fact, markets can be used for non-market ends, and at the same time, acknowledging some of the virtues of the market, but also some of the vices of the market. Now, of course, his text has its own limitations too, because it has its own parochialism. Here I am using a Western European language, right? I'm a New World African who dreams in a European language, dreams in English, right? And that language is the language of Shakespeare and Milton and Toni Morrison and Faulkner and others, but it's not the language of Chekhov. It's not the language of Tolstoy. So there's a certain kind of built-in parochialism that I perennially try to shatter, but I recognize I'm just a human being.
Do some blacks get mad at you for writing about Chekhov, a white man, and Kierkegaard and Kant and Hegel and all these people?
Sure, because they have a deep suspicion of, you know, certain Western philosophers. I understand the suspicion because they've been put down, they've been devalued and dishonored by a lot of Western thinkers. Look what Hegel said about Africa. It had no history.
Somebody in here called you the leading single black philosopher, maybe in the world, but in the United States certainly. Do you feel that when you go about?
No, not at all. Nah, I'm just brother off the block trying to make sense. I mean, a lot of people use these kind of terms, you know, but no, I don't take
just
it
a
that
brother
serious.
Off the block trying to make sense.
Trying to make sense. The world loves somebody before I die. That's all I'm trying to do. You know what I mean?
You give 150 lectures a year, it says in here?
Well, yeah, I've got quite a schedule. Quite a schedule. Very much so.
You're involved in the Bill Bradley campaign?
Very involved with my dear brother Bill Bradley. I've just been out in Iowa and New Hampshire and so forth.
You're honorary chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America?
Part of the great legacy of Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas and my dear friend, the late, great Michael Harrington, trying to keep alive again this democratic socialist ideal, which is more the name of a desire for justice than it is the name of a system. And it's hard to communicate to Americans the sense that this is a radical democratic view that accents the role of working people and poor people, of marginalized people, of gay and lesbian people, of peoples of color, of disabled, physically challenged people. All those who have been, in some sense, devalued by those who are viewed as normal, mainstream. And it's not PC chit-chat, because we're talking about some very, very scarred, bruised human beings, but they're not simply victims. They're agents in the world.
Is it fair to say, though, in this competitive marketplace that we have, that you have been a financial success?
That I have been able to make enough money to support my loved ones, my wife and son, and do, of course, anything for mom. I take a bullet for my mother, and family too. You're absolutely right. In fact, I have been privileged in an excessive manner, but at the same time, I've had to deal with the cost. You see, I had to deal with the cost because, you know, one of the most dangerous persons in the world is a self-loving, self-respecting black man who tells the truth about America. You see, so you got the death threats every day. You've had
death threats?
Oh, Lord, all the time.
From, you know where they're coming from?
Well, they come from very different sources, and, you know, people keep track of them all the time.
Are they all white people?
Yeah, definitely. It's a small slice of white supremacist folk out there who's out of control, you know. But there's a cost that you have to pay. There's no doubt about that. Now, would I rather be broke as the Ten Commandments and pay the cost? No. I'd rather have some resources and money. But is it seductive to have too much money? Absolutely right. That's why you have to use it in the right way, you see.
Where'd you meet your wife?
Met my wife in New Haven. New Haven.
Under what circumstances?
I was then teaching at the time, and she was working there. She's Ethiopian. Elena Ramlock, who has just put together this wonderful first international conference on AIDS in Addis Ababa. She's quite an activist dealing with the epidemic of AIDS and, on the continent and so forth. But we met almost 15 years ago now.
How many children?
We've got one son. My son is actually from an earlier marriage. Clifton.
How old is Clifton?
He's 22.
Is he the fourth?
He's 22. Well, not the fourth, because the middle name is different. See, my grandfather was Clifton. My father was Clifton. My brother was Clifton. But my brother named his son Cornell after me. I named my son Clifton after him. But it's different middle names. They were Clifton Lincoln, and he's Clifton
And what are they all doing now? The kids?
Who, the kids? Who was that? Cornell?
Your
Well,
kids,
Cornell's
yeah.
a poet, and my son is an aspiring actor.
Do they see life any differently than you do? And, I mean,
yes.
compared to what you grew up with and the black versus the white, what do they see that's different?
Well, one is that it's harder to sustain the webs of care these days with the families divided and shattered, with the communities much more dispersed. See, I grew up in a neighborhood. The young brothers and sisters of hip-hop culture and rap music say they're growing up in a hood. There's a big difference.
What's the difference?
Because the hood is social Darwinian space. It's a Hobbesian war of all against all, backstabbing, hard to forge bonds of trust and ties of sympathy. Neighborhood, where I grew up, tremendous care, love, nurture, overflowing. Everybody keeping track of me, you know, Mrs. Durham and Mrs. Burton and my mother and Reverend Willie B. Cook and Deacon Hinton, all these folk keeping track of me. In the hood, young folk out there rootless, dangling, deracinated, drifting.
Why? What changed?
What changed was they don't have enough adults in their lives. They don't have enough love and nurture that's targeting them. They don't have enough people who are concerned about them, who believe in them, keeping track of them.
Why not?
You see. Well, it's because of the shattered families and communities.
Why are the families shattered?
Well, for a number of reasons. One has to do with the fact that our economy is one in which so many are overworked and underpaid.
Why?
It's because not enough money is trickling down to working people. So much of the money is hemorrhaged at the top, one of the professional managers. And I give you an example. We got 6 million families in America where the father and the mother work 2 jobs between them. Now, if you have a father and mother work 2 jobs, less time with the kids.
Each working 2 jobs?
Each working 2, and that's growing. Not a lot of talk about it. Now, I mean, Bill Bradley's one of the few that want to talk about this thing. Not a lot of talk about that. You see why? Because economic boom, we're congratulating ourselves, we're complimenting ourselves on how well the stock market is doing, but when you actually look at the lives of everyday people, especially working people, right, we find they're overworked, underpaid, wrestling with a time famine. Sylvia Ann Hewlett and I wrote the book, The War Against Parents, trying to tell a story about this, right? And at the same time, the market cultures come in and completely reshape the lives of young people. TV, video, film, of what? It's deeply hedonistic, self-indulgent pleasures, instant gratification, violence, unbelievable in terms of not just physical violence, but the psychic violence. It creates a cold-heartedness and a mean-spiritedness toward one another. And we see this more and more among young people. And Littleton is just the peak of an iceberg.
Let me ask you about that, because in all those episodes like Littleton, they're, I don't know what, they're 8 or 9 the last couple of years.
Exactly.
They were all white males.
Yes.
Does that tell you anything?
Well, I mean, one, it means that this is a problem of our beloved children across race, across region. But it also is a function of the press. That is to say that black kids have been dealing with bullets for a long time in junior high and high school. But when black children point guns at other black children, that is less news than when white children point guns at other white children. Unfortunately, that's still the case in our society, you see. So that what we have a problem here now is the low quality of life of children in terms of the state of their souls, spiritual malnutrition, existential emptiness, hungry, thirsty for something bigger than themselves, but more and more finding themselves obsessed with instant gratification, obsessed with putting others down in order for them to feel like they are somebody, you see.
Go back to your own, this book
race.
And what you write in this book. Again, if somebody picks this book up, what's the one message you want them to get out of Cornell West throughout this book? And what's the advantage of reading all this?
Yeah, the advantage of reading is that there is a connection between cultivating the art of living and fighting courageously for the expansion of democracy. See, the art of living is learning how to die. And what I mean by that is that if you're really going to live life intensely, then something in you every day ought to die. Some bad habit, some prejudice, some faulty presupposition, so that you're continually involved in a struggle to better yourself, become more mature, more compassionate, more courageous. And we need that compassion and courage and maturity to expand democracy, because in the end, that is still the best ideal that we fragmented, cracked vessels called human beings have been able to come up with.
You say that the black means of cultural expression is two, music and preaching.
Well, historically, because black
I
people,
wanted to ask you what's happening in the preaching world today,
oh,
in the black
well,
churches.
Very, very rich indeed. And we got, you know, Reverend Gardner Taylor is probably the finest preacher in Christendom right now. And we've got Reverend Manuel Scott, Reverend Carolyn Knight. We can go on and on.
Do you preach?
No, I'm neither ordained nor licensed, even though a lot of people think I am. I'm a lay person, but I'm often asked to speak in churches, and I will accept invitations if I can do that. But the important thing to keep in mind, though, is that historically, of course, enslaved Africans were not allowed to read. It was against the law. So we brought the rich oral traditions of Africa. We with the drums, which themselves were also outlawed, but we began to clap. And at the same time, were exposed to European instruments or brought African instruments, so that early on in America you get this original indigenous form of cultural expression in spirituals, blues, jazz. But now that we've been able to gain the right to read after the Civil War, we've gone on to produce a very rich literary and intellectual tradition.
Let me ask you about some of the things I wrote down.
Sure.
It's in your book.
Sure.
Jackie Robinson, he knows that, quote, money is America's God.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you know him?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. But I mean, it echoes the great William James when he called the bitch god of success. A success in America. What is the American dream? For the most part, pecuniary gain and material success.
Does it ever pull you personally?
Oh, sure. It pulls all of us. It pulls all of us. But you see, Martin King said that his dream was rooted in the American dream, which is a critique of the American dream. We need prosperity, not a bad thing if it does not become idolatrous, if it does not become so seductive that it constitutes a false security. So we have to come up with new ways of dreaming that includes material resources but goes far beyond it.
Julian Malveaux, who is an economist, and we've had on our show many times, I detect a Chekhovian strand in her cultural and social criticism. Again,
profound sense of the comic. Profound sense of the comic.
You said that Chekhov had 8,000 characters?
8,000 characters. It's unbelievable.
And how many years did he write?
And he wrote from the age of 18 until the few days before he died.
I've just got one of the many books you can find on him in the
Yeah,
plays.
he's such a towering.
First time you ever read him?
I first read Chekhov when I was 19 years old, and I could see he had a blues sensibility. How do you keeping on with love and compassion, with some sense of justice toward all, but you're wrestling with levels of disappointment and disillusion that will never let you go.
My struggles with the Black Panther Party, I was never a member, but worked closely with them. I just took that out of context. My struggles with the Black Panther Party.
Oh, yeah, the Black Panther Party was very, very important to me in terms of first trying to give us a sense of an analysis of the system, both the capitalist economy and the system of white supremacy. Now, later we'd have to understand the system of male supremacy, the system of heterosexism and homophobia. But the system, it was not just a matter of individual prejudice when we talked about race. It was a matter of its relation to the workplace, the exploitation of black labor. How do you bring black and white workers together? How do you bring black, white, red, yellow workers together? My problem early on was that they trashed the black church, you see. And as a Christian, I thought that was both understandable but unfair. That is to say, there's nothing wrong with being very critical of the black church. There's no doubt you've got a lot of black preachers out there doing things they ought not do. But you got a lot of black lawyers, you got a lot of black doctors, a lot of black pharmacists, black professors. Let's be open-ended in our criticism.
By the way, how many black professors are there now in the African American Studies program at Harvard?
Oh God, we must have about 8 now almost. Yes, and you know, again, Brother Skip, Professor Gates is his leadership is such that we're bringing in some high quality folk. We need more women actually, but bringing in some high quality folk, and most importantly, constituting an intellectual neighborhood. That's what we're after.
Could a white person ever teach black studies?
Oh no, we've got a number of black, a number of white colleagues. Oh, very much so in the department.
Do you feel different when you know you're going to be interviewed by a white person versus a black person?
Not necessarily. Depends who they are. You know, there's a lot of soulful white brothers and sisters, and a lot of black brothers and sisters who need more soul.
Do you ever get an interviewer these days, maybe even a white interviewer that's antagonistic toward you?
Oh shoot, I'll get antagonism toward interview with black, white, red, or whatever, and so and lack of antagonism with black, white, red. It's more of a human thing.
I guess what I was asking is whether you see racism as much today as you used to.
Well, it's still around though. Yeah,
but do you see
around. It? Oh sure, I see it.
Do you see it in your classes?
So. Less so in the classes though. I think. I mean, in my class of 400 students, I would guess maybe about 67% would be white, and the exchanges and dialogues and interactions there are very challenging and humane and so forth. But I mean, you know, white supremacy is still operating. It's just it can be more subtle in certain contexts. But that's less the problem than the ways in which that operation is connected to denying people jobs with living wage and health care and shelter. Somebody like myself, I mean, it's less important because I've been able to ascend to certain levels, you know.
In your book of 600 pages, $35, the Cornell West Reader, this is another quote. You say this, it takes at least 25 years to, and I can't even read my own writing here, to lay an adequate foundation to do the kind of work one is called to do. What were the circumstances that made you say that?
Well, it's because I consider this particular work as an early stage in my life work. Because I've really yet to do what I really want to do.
Which is?
You see. What I really want to do is to, on the one hand, I want to lay bare the rich depths of the souls of American peoples in general and black peoples in particular in regard to our contribution to world civilization. How we wrestle with the sense of the tragic and the comic, what is distinctive about our democratic sensibilities, why are we the most market-driven and the most religiously saturated of peoples as Americans vis-a-vis other peoples, you see. And we have to do that in a comparative way. That's why I go to the Russians, because the Russians have the richest, deepest, most profound literary tradition of the modern world.
Have you been there?
You see. Never been to Russia. Been there spiritually, intellectually, but never been there physically. Never been there physically. They have a thickness that we don't have in America. American culture is one much newer, of course. You know, it's just been around since 1776 in terms of the nation state. And we have a flow of immigrants who are Americanized but bring with them very rich baggage, but at the same time have to learn how to adjust and adapt to the new American ways. And as Eugene O'Neill, our greatest playwright, pointed out, that we tend to be a people who think we can possess our souls by possessing commodities rather than digging deep in our souls. This is why the blues and jazz is so very important, you see, because it's one of the few examples in American civilization where it doesn't believe the hype about the melodramatic, sentimental stories of the happy ending, nor is it cynical. It tries to tell the truth about America, but also sustain the possibility of America.
Earlier, when we opened up with some theme music from John Coltrane, and this you knew, I did not show you this in advance. You knew this was 1959.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have everything he's ever
Oh, no,
recorded?
Coltrane was so prolific. Yeah, it's like trying to read all of Tolstoy. You know, you spend a lifetime. But, I mean, the peaks. And most importantly, it's not a question of how much, but it's how deeply you have internalized his sensibility.
Do you collect music? Do you listen to music?
Yeah, I do. I do. I mean, listen to a variety of music. Coltrane, of course, is at the center. But it's I carry Coltrane around with me every day, the way I carry Chekhov around with me every day. And it's linked not just to the music as some ornament some art object, but it's got to become part of your soul. You know, when Chekhov says, I wake up every morning squeezing the slave out of me so that I will have the I have running in my veins the blood of a real human being. You see, that's Coltrane and Chekhov.
You have an interview in your book, a 1998 interview with David Smith, the Dean of Faculty at Williams.
A good friend, and yes, he's a brilliant and wonderful brother and distinguished professor, and the Dean of Faculty. Actually, he's the first black Dean of the Faculty at Williams College.
In Massachusetts.
In Williamstown. It's a great
But let me just read what he said in here. Your eclecticism, I didn't have the whole quote here. You'll know what I'm talking about. Your eclecticism reflects, he says, some people say your eclecticism reflects a kind of shallowness. You are simply a skillful speaker who has borrowed bits of knowledge, haven't mastered any discipline. He was kind of challenging you to answer that criticism. Do you get a lot of that?
Some of it, sure. I mean, I've got critics who've gone at me tough, and you always must listen to your critics when they're trying to teach and tell you something, even though you also have critics who don't do their homework. They don't really read you that closely. They don't really engage your material. And then, of course, you always have envy operating, which is a sad thing, but that's human, all too human. And so you have to just keep moving and keep doing your work. But you have to be very, very attuned to claims that can make you better. There's a sense in which you are only as good as your foes, because if your foes are strong, they make you strong. But on the other hand, you don't demonize them because they've got their own insecurities and anxieties that they're dealing with, and you want to empower them in the same way that they, ironically, can end up empowering you. But the eclecticism is real. That I'm someone who, like a jazz man, is improvisational, experimental, pulling from a lot of different traditions. People say, well, how could you talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson and Louis Armstrong in the same vein? Well, they're both experimental.
When you go back to your class for a second, when you are, what lecture in your classes do you find them on the edge of their chair? Is there one more than the others?
Probably the music lecture. And it's primarily because music in the lives of young people, for many, is the last form of transcendence. It's their fundamental form of...
From bebop to rap. Is that
well, no, we go all the way back from work songs of slaves through spirituals, through blues, through jazz.
How long do you lecture
rhythm
on this?
And blues. I have a week lecture, 2 hours.
2-hour lecture?
Yeah.
And you get the most interest.
And, of course, we hear the music itself. You know, you turn on Billie Holiday to sing about strange fruit, the southern tree is bare, that American institution of lynching, and the students. Coltrane blows Alabama, the students. Listen to Monk play Ruby, My Dear. The students. Wow. A lot of them don't know. Black or white or red or yellow or whatever, they don't know, you see. Now, by the time you get to Prince, all of a sudden they're ready to move because they have some acquaintance, you see. But you say, well, this is a rich tradition, you see. The Isley Brothers are inseparable from Billy Eckstine, inseparable from Johnny Hartman. This is a tradition with a variety of different voices, you see. But it's rooted in craft, technique, discipline on the one hand, and wrestling with the dark side of America on the other, pain, suffering, grief, oppression, domination.
Which, in the history of the United States, which white male or female do you think, they had to take a risk, though, in doing this, were the most sympathetic to changing the racial differences?
I would say Miles Horton, the founder of Highlander Center. He was just an indescribably courageous and visionary white brother from Tennessee. Highlander Center was where Rosa Parks, the great Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Tumwe, we just lost him 2 years ago, Brother Bob Moses, Diane Nash, a whole host of freedom fighters of all colors would spend time at Highlander Center and would be sent back. It's in Tennessee.
Okay, but what white politician? Who's the most courageous white politician in history for the race issue?
Well, in terms of effect, of course, it would be Lyndon Baines Johnson, even though he underwent a wonderful change from his early years. In terms of sheer courage, it would probably have to, politician. John Brown was not a politician, but he died for black people and black freedom. Politician, good God Almighty, that's a good question. It would probably be, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I think today there's no doubt that Bill Bradley takes this issue more seriously than any of the other white politicians. But historically, probably Wendell Phillips. Wendell Phillips, that's who it is. Harvard College, Boston Brahmin, and what a crusader for racial justice.
Let me take a risk and give you an opinion of what I did not find in this book.
Yeah.
600 pages. I'm not sure I'm right about this. You tell me. I didn't find much anger. I mean, the kind of rhetorical anger you see in speeches and writing. Am I right or?
Well, we'd have to distinguish between rage and
I'm talking
anger.
about, that's what I'm talking about, rage.
Yeah, because
But why not?
My rage tends to be filtered through more positive channels when it comes to fighting for justice, fighting for more democracy and freedom, you see. But you're right. I mean, for me, anger is can be empowering, but it has to be connected to a courage to love and a courage to fight for justice.
When can you remember ever being angry or enraged in public?
In public, because I'm full of rage all the time, but I transfigure it, you know what I mean? And part of it, my own Christian sensibility plays a role here too, because, Christians cannot love people without hating injustice, without having a rage against cruelty. And that's why Jesus goes to the temple and overturns the temple of the money changers and ends up on the cross. So that the last moment in public, oh my God, God, it's hard to say, actually. It's hard to say.
What's the next project on your list?
Well, I've got a number of books. I've got a book on David Hume. I've got a book on Josiah Royce. I've got a book on African-American literature and modern Greek literature that I'm writing with a fascinating cultural critic. Her name is Eleni Mavromontadou. Mavromontadou, that's her name. It's a hard thing because it's Greek. But then I've got the big book on Chekhov and Coltrane.
When's that out?
Working on many years to come. I got a lot of work, a lot of growing to do.
We're out of time. As we show you the cover of the book, it's called The Cornell West Reader, put out by Civitas and Basic Books.